Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Fertility Network UK's 2023 LGBTQ plus Pathway to Parenthood course. My name is Bethan and my pronouns are she, her. And I work for Fertility Network UK, and I provide support to people on a fertility journey, but also I lead on our organisation's LGBTQ plus specific support. So tonight is the first session in this 6-week course that will cover the sort of various options that we have as LGBTQ plus people in creating a family. And each week we'll be joined by experts in their fields to focus on one topic. And I'm delighted that this year we'll be covering not just our options within fertility clinics, such as surrogacy, IUI, IVF, and shared motherhood, but also this course will look at adoption too. And also for those who are trans, it will cover fertility preservation. We'll also sort of focus on the legal implications, donor conception, funding, and the last session will be joined by a panel of LGBTQ plus people who have their families, and they'll share their lived experience of accessing IUI, IVF, adoption, and surrogacy. So each week, the expert would deliver a short presentation tailored to our communities before opening up to a Q&A session. So please do just post any questions tonight in the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can. As a reminder, these sessions are being recorded, so you'll be able to watch them back as we'll share them on our YouTube channels. And for reassurance, we're only recording the speakers. So without further ado, let's begin our first session on the overview of the various pathways. And I'm delighted to be joined by Francesca Steyn from both the Royal College of Nursing and Peppy Health. So welcome, Fran.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yes, feel free to ask any questions. I'll do my best to answer as many of them as I can. I'll share my screen. And let's, can we see that all right? Can you see that all right? Okay, Bethan?
I can, perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm Fran. I am a fertility nurse. I've been a fertility nurse for around 18 years now. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the pathways to parenthood, not just for a fertility clinic, give you a bit of an overview and hopefully some information to take away. I've done a lot of work with supporting the community in their pathways to parenthood and built specific programs within clinics to make sure that you are getting the right treatment and the right support that you need. So this is just a bit of an overview of what's available out there, really. So just a little bit of an intro. So patient groups and considerations. So we know that LGBTQ plus millennials are now more aware of their options for having children. An NBC News report from a little while ago, 2021, I think, actually showed that 53%, and that was in 2021, so it will have grown since then, of millennials aged between the age of reproductive health and growing up and plan to become parents or increase their families. And the people that were surveyed as part of that report for NBC News were same-sex female couples, same-sex male couples, single gay people, trans people, non-binary people. So there was a good mix of people there on different journeys who were planning to become parents in the future. And it's growing, as I said. That was in 2021. I think if NBC did that again this year around, we'll see that it's much higher. And we see it in the clinics all the time. But people want to start fertility treatments or other options into becoming parents. Okay, so looking at a little bit about the parenthood options. So some of the things that we'll cover in this session, and as I said, please feel free to ask me any questions. If it's something that's not here in this presentation and you want a bit more information about it, I'm more than happy to talk about it. But yeah, so please ask any questions that you need to. But to start off with, we're going to be looking at fertility preservation for trans and non-binary people and how that starts on a pathway to parenthood, and what you might need to consider if you are in a trans or a non-binary person and you want to look at having a child in the future. Surrogacy, how that looks for same-sex couples and single gay men and trans people, who can access treatment, how do you go about it, Co-parenting doesn't always have to take place for a fertility clinic, but sometimes it does. We often see that co-parenting agreements are made up by single gay men and friends and same-sex couples. I don't know why I've duplicated the word couples there, sorry about that, but this is the sort of treatments that we sometimes offer and see, or sometimes see taking place outside of fertility clinics for those groups. Adoption, previously, many years ago, adoption was always seen as a bit of a last resort on a pathway to parenthood, which is absolutely not the case. We see a lot of people now choosing adoption and fostering actually as the first route to parenthood, and choosing it as, you know, as a non-invasive route to parenthood. I mean, it doesn't come without its stresses, of course, because there are many paths that you have to take, and the process is still there and it's in place, but it's very much, you know, an available option if you are thinking about growing or building your family. Adoption is an option. Shared motherhood, reciprocal IVF, or sometimes you might hear other intrapartner donation, sometimes that's referred to in clinics, but shared motherhood and reciprocal IVF is usually for same-sex female couples, where one will carry the pregnancy and one will donate the eggs, but we'll talk a bit about that. Donor insemination, so donor insemination with a sperm donor, whether it's a known donor or someone from a donor bank. So single trans people, non-binary people, lesbian couples, single women often will go down the route of donor insemination through a fertility clinic, but home insemination, you know, is available for everyone. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But home insemination is essentially having insemination with sperm from a donor, known donor, at the time of ovulation. And that can often happen at home as well for couples or people. What I'll say is that in co-parenting, what we do see is that if co-parenting couples, so if it's a same-sex female couple and they're using a friend to be a co-parent, which we do see quite a lot, you are everyone involved. So it's dependent on how you have a relationship with the male co-parent who's providing the sperm. You can all have some sort of parental responsibility for the child, but you still only legally can have two parents. So two parents can only be legally on the birth certificate, but more people can have parental responsibility. So you could have the two female couples, the female couple on the birth certificate, and the donor, the male donor, as with parental responsibility, or however you decide that's right for your family. But you can have more people with parental responsibility. And the difference really between parental responsibility and legal parenthood, which I won't go too much into because I know that it will be covered later on in this series, is that legally you're responsible for maintaining that child financially and well-being, and parental responsibility is providing responsibility as a parent, basically, so supporting them, loving them up, and helping them grow. But that will be covered more in this series. Okay, so first we're going to dip into surrogacy. So surrogacy as a route to family building has changed over the years. It's becoming a lot more popular, especially in the LGBTQ+ community, as a pathway to parenthood and becoming a parent. It is becoming a lot more popular, but it is still quite a difficult process. So there's two main routes to surrogacy. Host surrogacy is when embryos are created using eggs and sperm, and they're created in vitro, so IVF in the lab. And it's often, sometimes, if it's a gay couple, a gay male couple, they'll often use an egg donor to help them create the embryos. And the embryo is transferred into a surrogate. So that's known as host surrogacy. So the host surrogate doesn't have any biological or genetic connection to the child. She or he, the child themselves, will have genetic material from one of the dads and an egg donor, if that's how the surrogate agreement takes place. So that's generally what happens. What you can have in host surrogacy is the surrogate will also use her own eggs to create the pregnancy. So then, if it's again a gay couple, a gay male couple, one of the intended fathers, so one of the dads, will provide sperm, and the surrogate will also provide her eggs and the embryos will be created and she will have the embryo transfer. She will have a biological and genetic link to that child. But generally what we see is with host surrogacy, we have the surrogates who do not have any genetic or biological material involved. They are seen as the host, so they do carry the pregnancy. In straight surrogacy, it's slightly different. So straight surrogacy can often be it's insemination. It can take place at home. So not all surrogacy cases do go through fertility clinics, so they can take place at home via home insemination. So what you often find with straight surrogacy is that a sperm of an intended father is inseminated into the uterus of a surrogate at her most fertile time. So when she's ovulating, when she's releasing an egg, they know that that's the most fertile time. So a sperm sample will be provided and injected into the uterus to hopefully achieve a pregnancy. Now, again, that's similar to how host surrogacy works if the surrogate is using her own eggs. So if she will have a biological and genetic link to the child. Some couples and some single people decide that that's not ideal for them. They'd rather have the surrogate is separate and no genetic materials passed, and so that's why they choose to use an egg or sperm donor with their treatment. Two key pieces of legislation changed in surrogacy, which meant that gay people and single people could be parents through surrogacy. Before 2010, you couldn't. You had to be a heterosexual couple, which is really archaic and really discriminatory. So luckily it has changed. So 2010, gay couples could apply for a parental order. So they could apply for a parental order, which meant that they were the legal parents of their children born through surrogacy. Prior to that time, you would have to adopt. And there were many people living in the UK with who had their children living with them, but they weren't legal parents because they weren't able to be, because this parental order process wasn't in place. Then when that law changed, people were able to become, so there was a lot of people that replied in retrospect, so they did become the legal parents of their children. And then in 2019, which was more recent, single people could apply for a parental order. So that meant our single female, single men, single non-binary people, single trans people could also apply for a parental order to be parents of their children through surrogacy arrangements. And there's more coming. So surrogacy in the UK, again, is changing, and it will change. There's been a lot of work that's been taking place over quite some time. I remember this being started way back in, I want to say in 2017, when the all-party parliamentary group for surrogacy was formed. It might have even been 2016, but anyway, so around that time, the all-party parliamentary group for surrogacy was formed in order to try and tackle these problems that we had with surrogacy. One of the main things in the UK is that if you have a child born through surrogacy currently, it means that the surrogate is the legal parent, and if she's got a partner, her partner will also be the legal parent. So it means that you are not the legal parents of your children when that child's born, which opens up a whole heap of problems, especially if baby's sick in hospital and you can't make those decisions because the surrogate will need to make them because she's seen as the legal parent. So there's lots of things that need to be changed. And there's some other, there's a lot of other issues with the current surrogacy laws because they came about in 1985, I believe, from when the Surrogacy Act was brought in. So there's a lot of problems with that. It's a very old law and it needs to be changed, and it is being changed, but it's currently sitting in Parliament now as a draft surrogacy bill. So this current draft surrogacy bill was released at the end of March, and the government have got 6 months to respond. So hopefully by the end of September we might see some response from them and plans to put some of these recommendations in place. But what will happen is that there will be a new pathway to legal parenthood. Basically, it means that intended parents, so whether you're a gay male couple, a trans person, single person applying for surrogacy and applying to be the legal parent of your child, you can do that before the child's born. So when the child is, when your surrogate's pregnant, you can apply for a parental order and become the legal parent at birth. So you can make those crucial decisions and know that you are the legal parent of your child straight away. We've got some various fantastic surrogacy organisations in the UK that support intended parents and surrogates on their pathways to building out a surrogacy arrangement. Those are currently they're not for profit, and they're run by a lot of volunteers who've got experience in surrogacy, but they will become potentially regulated surrogacy organisations, so that means they will be governed by potentially the HFEA, which is the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority, which is our governing body in the UK for all fertility care. So they will be governed and will be subject to quite strict processes and procedures in order to ensure that they can support the people that they're looking after. There will be changes to parental orders for those that do still require a parental order and don't fit into the criteria for the new pathway. So it will be easier to obtain one, potentially. The process will be easier to apply. A surrogacy register, so there will be a register available so that people that are born from surrogacy can track their origins. That currently isn't in place. There are donor registers, so if you use donor sperm or donor eggs, there's registers for that, but there isn't a surrogacy register, so that's been proposed, and it can be for retrospective bill. People can apply to go onto that register in retrospect if they've already been born as a result of surrogacy. There's new rules on payments, so what's allowed and not allowed. So at the moment, you can only pay reasonable expenses to a surrogate for carrying your child. But this will outline a bit more firmly what's okay and what's not, and what's prohibited. Commercial surrogacy still remains illegal in the UK, and that's when you're advertising for a surrogate and paying your surrogate. It still works very well in the UK on altruism, and knowing your surrogate and building a relationship with them, and that's the way it will stay in the UK, because that's the way we believe that it should be working, and it works quite well, the altruistic model. And international surrogacy agreements will be recognised. We have a lot of people that go overseas for surrogacy for many reasons, and there's always been a bit of a hit and miss about how that works in the UK, but those will be recognised here now, potentially with this new bill, so that it can be much easier for people to go overseas and have their treatment and come back with their children. Okay, so this is definitely a whistle-stop tour. So moving on from surrogacy to fertility preservation. Now, we do see a lot of trans people, non-binary people coming into the clinics for fertility preservation. So whether they're going to freeze eggs or sperm before they start any sort of treatment or transition, they may come into clinic and to see us in order to freeze gametes first. Now, there is a little bit of a pathway here, and what we do recognise is that most trans and non-binary people have been through such a journey to get to that fertility clinic first. There's been a whole heap of hospital and clinic appointments in gender clinics and things like that, undertaking different medications sometimes, and lots of tests, and also lots of different therapies. So, to get to the point of the clinic to start preserving fertility is not it's not an easy journey at all. So, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it, because you've already been through a lot. So it can also be quite stressful when you decide that you do want to think about parenting in the future. But just to give you an overview of how it works in the fertility clinic, if you do decide that that's something that you want to consider. So trans men and non-binary people, if you were assigned female at birth and you've got eggs on board, then we would suggest to freeze your eggs. Now, the way that we do that is you go through a cycle of treatment where the ovaries are stimulated with gonadotrophins to stimulate the growth of the follicles, which are the fluid-filled sacs that contain the eggs. And then the eggs are collected when they're mature enough to be collected. It is a little bit of a surgical procedure, but you will be asleep for. So the eggs are extracted. You shouldn't feel a thing. You should be completely asleep, really. And then once it doesn't take very long, to about 20 minutes, the eggs are then taken, checked in the laboratory and frozen. Those sit within that clinic in liquid nitrogen, so they're quite safe until you wish to use them, or if you wish to use them in the future. Now, you can freeze those and then later on down the line find a sperm donor or partner sperm if you do want to create embryos for future treatment. You can also freeze embryos. So if you have got a partner when you are going through this process and they do have sperm, you can choose to create embryos with sperm. So you've got the eggs, you can use a sperm donor or sperm of your partner and create embryos to freeze. And then those embryos can be frozen until you're ready to use them. You then can think about future surrogacy. So surrogacy we've all just covered very briefly, but if you do decide that you do want to go on and have a child with your biological material, then you might want to consider a surrogacy arrangement, because you've already got the embryos there, and then it's just a case of working with potentially one of the surrogacy organisations to find a surrogate to carry for you. Things that you may need to consider at this time when you're thinking about freezing the eggs is if you are on T therapy, so if you are taking testosterone, you might want to consider stopping it around the time of the egg collection. There is some evidence and research out there, which we've got a speaker I know further down the line, Dr. Gilling Smith, who's done a lot of work in this area, who has looked at stuff where there is cases where you may not have to stop that testosterone, but at the moment I think the recommendations are that you do stop it while you're considering treatment, and then restarting testosterone after the treatment. And the most important thing I will say is about counselling and emotional well-being. As I said, trans people, non-binary people have already been on such a journey to get to where they need to go to. Fertility treatment is stressful. So making sure that you've got the support there and using the clinics and counselling services, their specialist fertility counsellors to chat you through and support you is so important. And of course, FNUK do have amazing support groups, so do reach out to them too, because they're there to support you and they do fantastic work. And then it's similar for trans women and non-binary people if they were assigned male at birth and they've got sperm. So we would think about sperm freezing. It's much simpler than the egg collection process. We would ask that you come into clinic and produce some samples so that we can freeze so you can consider having treatment later on. If you've got a partner and you want to and they have eggs, then we can think about embryo freezing at that time, or we can think about embryo freezing at a later date with an egg donor or partner. Future surrogacy, as we've already said, so if you're considering using those embryos that are created or using that sperm later on, you could think about potentially surrogacy arrangements. Considerations about stopping hormone therapy again, because we know that you may be taking some sort of estrogens and things like that, and what that might mean when you are having treatment. We do potentially give you some sorts of estrogens when we're doing treatments. So what it might mean is that you just need to consider what you might need and what you might not need. But for these sort of cases, it's probably okay if you do continue, but we just need to check with the doctors around that time. And counselling again and emotional well-being, I can't stress how important that is, because it really is, if you need the proper support and advice to start your journey, because it can be really overwhelming. And something just to think about when you are, if you are transitioning or going through treatment and you're considering it. So we, for trans and non-binary people, what we want is them to be registered with the clinic in the gender they identify as. Now, that's really important because we know that some hospitals and clinics don't always get this right, because they think that they have to register what's on your passport. That's absolutely not true. What we need to do is be registering you as the patient as who you are, as you present to us, which is really important. And you are absolutely within your rights to say to the clinic, if you go there or a hospital or any other facility and they are saying that they will not register you in this way, that this is the law, and that's how it should be maintained. So, and then if people are transitioning and they've transitioned after, say, for example, you have frozen your eggs and you've got eggs sitting in a clinic freezer, if you have then legally changed your gender when the GRC certificate's been issued, because again, it's a long and lengthy process to apply for a gender recognition certificate. It can take really a long time. They've reduced the cost now and it's just down to £5, which is a lot better, but it's still a very lengthy process. So if you do then want to go back to the clinic and register and provide updated identification, you absolutely can, but they still will be registering you in the gender that you identify as and your name. When you receive a new passport or form of photographic identity that reflects your gender, you can take that to the clinic and they can add that to your file, but it shouldn't change anything because you're already registered as you are. And clinics definitely should only be using current names and identifiers on medical records and consent forms. Now, just to give you a bit of an idea, that if you're sitting in a waiting room and you are known as a different name, and you've presented with that name, and someone comes out with a form with your name that you was born with, and you don't go by that name and reads that out, and it's a different gender to how you identify, then that can be really traumatic. So know your rights, know that you can go into a clinic and say, this is the way that I identify, and this is how I want to be addressed. And you absolutely can do that. So transparenting. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Freddie McConnell and Tristan Reese. I don't know if you know them, but they are two trans men who still have uteruses and have carried their own children. So again, this is another option that's available. So, Freddie and Tristan were on testosterone therapy, so had to stop, but they had their own treatment. So actually Tristan didn't have any fertility treatment. He had natural conception with his partner, but Freddie did have fertility treatment. So these are two trans men who carried their own children and have had more children actually since these pictures were taken, and they did give me consent to be able to use these. I've popped the links there on the slides. So Freddie, I don't know if you know about it, it was a film called The Seahorse Documentary about his pathway to parenthood. And Tristan is very, very vocal and speaks publicly, and he's written a book about his pathway to parenthood too. But this is just to give you an idea that, there are options available to everyone. And just because you're a man and you've got a uterus does not mean you can't carry your own child. I think, previously people like Tristan and Freddie would have been told that they need surrogacy or pushed into a different route to parenthood, or maybe even told that they couldn't have children. So I think just making it clear that it's completely possible, it's completely legal, and it's completely acceptable is what we should be doing. Okay, so moving on again to shared motherhood, or sometimes called reciprocal IVF. It depends on which clinic you're having treatment at. So it is a routine treatment for lesbian couples or same-sex female couples. It's offered in many clinics. When I first started out, it wasn't offered everywhere at all. I think there was only a couple of clinics that offered shared motherhood cycles, but now it's part of the furniture. So it's pretty much offered everywhere. You do need to have an IVF cycle of treatment, so it does need to take place in a fertility clinic. And as I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, one partner will go through the egg collection and use her eggs, and one partner goes through an embryo transfer cycle and then carries the child. This gives each parent a biological or gestational connection to the child, which is one of the main reasons and attractions why same-sex female couples will go through a shared motherhood pathway, so that they've both got that link to their child. In the UK, the egg provider, so the partner who's giving her eggs for the treatment, must be screened and treated as a donor. This is a bit controversial. It really is, because it wasn't always the case. But there was a law that came out a couple of years ago that meant that if you were giving eggs and you weren't having them back into your own uterus, then you needed to be screened and treated as a donor. It can be seen as a bit discriminatory. And let me tell you, I've gone on my high horse about this many times. The Department of Health and the HFEA are looking at it, and the HFEA definitely see that it's a bit of an issue. So it is being looked at. But it means that the egg provider will have to go through a whole heap of screening, as if someone who is donating their eggs, to an unknown couple. So including cystic fibrosis and karyotyping and syphilis screening. So all of the different screens that you would need to have on top of your routine HIV and hepatitis and things that you'd have on the clinic. So it's quite a lot. It's also very costly, because these screening tests are not free usually, so you do have to pay for them, so they're very, very expensive. So again, it's putting an actual financial strain on couples going through treatment. And then the other thing is, if it does come back positive, so if you do get a positive result for cystic fibrosis, for example, then you can still proceed, because it's a known donor cycle, because you're a couple, which seems crazy to me. So why would you go through all this process of screening in the first place? Because it's the law, and then you can still proceed. But it is being looked at, I can assure you. But don't be alarmed if you do think about shared motherhood as your route to parenthood, if you go and be hit with a whacking great bill for over £1,000 for all these tests that are required. Because it's part of the regulation now, although it's being challenged. And this is just from the two of my friends, Ria and Laura, and their son, who they went through a reciprocal IVF cycle, shared motherhood cycle, a long time ago actually now. And again, they've given me consent to use this image, and they're known as Two Mums and Tobias on Instagram. But they went through this cycle and then, you know, have been through treatment after that, which they're more than happy to talk about, but I won't share their story in case they want to. Donor insemination. Again, another routine treatment for same-sex female couples or single people. Single people with a uterus. It's offered in many clinics, and it's quite a straightforward procedure. I say straightforward, it's more straightforward than IVF and surrogacy and those sort of ones, and fertility preservation for trans and non-binary people, because it works with mainly your natural cycle. You may be given some medication such as tablets or injections, and then you have the insemination with donor sperm, known donor sperm, if you're choosing a known donor at the time of ovulation, around the time of ovulation. But it can be done at home as well. So you can have home insemination, so it does not have to go through the clinic. So there are many people that are having home insemination, like in co-parenting cycles. So if you decided that you want to go down a co-parenting route, it's very good practice to seek some legal advice first from a specialist family lawyer, but you can absolutely do home insemination at the time that you're most fertile. All we'd recommend is that you just, you know, have a bit of a sexual health screen first with your donor, so that you know that everything's okay and you can proceed. If you have donor insemination in the clinic, you'll be required to have those tests anyway. If you have donor insemination in the clinic, usually the recommendation is up to 6 cycles, and that's in the NICE guidelines. They say it takes around 6 cycles to achieve a pregnancy through DI. But after 3, they may reassess and discuss with you what the next steps are. You can use sperm that's provided by a donor in the UK. So many fertility clinics will have their own sperm donors that donate to the clinic, or they may import from an overseas sperm bank, or you can import from an overseas sperm bank and use the sperm at the clinic. Now, many clinics will work with different overseas sperm banks, but what they just need to make sure is that the donor that you're importing meets the regulation of donor insemination in the UK. So what we mean by that is that the donor is screened as we expect, so we know that their health background, but also that they haven't created too many families. The donor limit in the UK is 10 families. So a donor that donates to you may have also created up to another 10 families. And so some donors overseas do not fit that criteria, and some donors overseas are still anonymous, whereas the UK is known, it's unknown donation, it's not anonymous, so they can be traced. So when your child reaches 16, they can look for unidentified information about their donor, but when they reach 18, they can find identifying information, and the donors need to consent to that. And it will just be last name and address and things like that. And you can use a no donor. So if you've got a friend that wants to be part of the arrangement, so if they want to be a known donor to support you, they can be used, but they'll just need to be screened and consented the same way as a donor would at the clinics. And again, for co-parenting, so they might need to have some more screening. So adoption and fostering, we talked about adoption at the beginning, as it not being a last resort. Just to give you an idea about what's available and what it looks like for adoption and fostering. So the Adoption and Children Act that came to force in 2005, it gives everyone the legal rights to adopt, regardless of their sexuality or gender. Now, previously people thought that if they were single, if they were in a same-sex relationship, if they were a trans person, that they couldn't adopt, which is absolutely not the truth. They absolutely can, and we see more and more people choosing adoption as a pathway to parenthood now and giving loving homes to adoptees. 1 in 6 adoptions that took place in 2020 were by same-sex parents, which is, I think, huge, and just goes to show that adoption, again, is not an end route. It's a first-line pathway to parenthood and a route that many people choose. And then in 2021, the Quorum Adoption Agency, so they are an online resource, said that 1 in 5 children that were adopted were placed with loving lesbian, gay or bi or trans adopters, which I think is amazing. And it means that many children out there are getting the right loving homes and care that they need. And just a little bit about fostering. People do sometimes choose to foster first, especially if, this is going to sound a little bit complex, but There are some children that are in foster care before they're legally up for adoption. So there are some people that have to put their babies into foster care as soon as they're born, so they're not legally able to be adopted yet, so they have to go into foster care first. So you can opt to be a foster carer to look after those children that are not in the stage of adoption yet and are in foster care until they legally can be adopted. So that's and it's sometimes called as temporary fostering, but it's an absolutely an approved way of building your family. But it's also, if you're not quite sure how adoption is going to work for you, and if you do know that you want to support and give a loving home and a family support to foster children, you can choose that route too. But first, for adoption, I will mention here is and are a bit like Adoption UK, have a wealth of resource and are, you can go on their websites at any time. This is a really good infographic that I found on the adoption process, which shows you the stages. Again, previously people used to think that adoption was really, really long-winded. You wouldn't be accepted. There was lots of rejection. It's still a lengthy process, but what we see now is it takes about 6 months from start to finish. But you've got lots of support. There's a lot of support there. There's a lot of understanding. There's also a lot of support groups and education. So Adoption UK, for example, do put on some educational events to teach you about adoption before if you're just starting out and thinking about it and things like that. So there's a lot of support to take you through the journey. And there's various different ways that you can look at adoption. So you can look at adoption by going to your local councils, or going through places like Bernardo's. But there are lots of different options out there. And there's also some advice and support around if you adopt from overseas. But as I said, it's a perfectly accepted way to achieve your family and build your family. And there's lots of children out there crying for loving homes. And it's not a last resort. It really, really is very much a first line pathway to parenthood. Oh, I've gone a bit too far there, sorry. So this is just the last slide, and I just want to talk a little bit about some of the struggles that LGBTQI people do face when they're on a journey to parenthood. And it's not fair that this is still the case, but just to give you an idea and to know that you can get the support and access and to care that you need. We see it all the time, but some struggles definitely include funding. So we know that Whitney and Megan Bacon-Evans have been campaigning tirelessly for same-sex funding for them, because it's non-existent. We know that still gay men do not get any funding. Some trans people may get funding to store their eggs or sperm, some non-binary people may, but they may just get the funding for the fertility preservation part. It's still really, really a postcode lottery when it comes to what you can receive funding-wise. So check. I know that FNUK have got a fantastic resource again about what your funding options are and criteria, but there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Discrimination, we still see it all the time. There's a lot of discrimination out there against all families. So it would be silly of us just to ignore that does go on, but seek the help and advice that you need to deal with that, especially from a legal perspective. Legal aspects, we still see that LGBTQIA people are having to go through much more of a jumping of hoops, if you like, through clinics to become legal parents of their children, signing various forms and things like that. I hope that changes in the future, but there are, more legal aspects. Look for surrogacy, for example. If you've got a same-sex male couple, currently they're still not the legal parents of their children when they're born. So I'm hoping that those things change. But again, get the right support and advice that you need. One of these big things, being outed, the type of treatment that you choose, if you do it for a fertility clinic, may out you, and then that may bring in a lot of more stress and anxiety for you. So get the advice and support that you need, and use the counsellors in the clinic, that they're there to support you. There's lots more complexities, there's lots more things involved, donor sperm, screening, things like that. So there does seem to be a lot more of a journey that people have to go on. Timeframes, you have to wait. You can't just say tomorrow, right, I'm going to be a dad. Especially if you're using surrogacy, you've got to wait sometimes up to a year for a surrogate. Same with like same-sex female couples with the donor sperm, they might have to wait. You have to wait for funding from the NHS. There's still, it's not fair. It's not equal across at all. And these are the things that we need to be doing more work on. And choosing a clinic, I'll say, not every clinic out there is equipped to support you on your journey to parenthood. Choose a clinic that you feel comfortable at, and that you know that you are going to get the best care. And not everyone gets pregnant, we know that. I wish everyone did, but they don't. But know that you're being looked after. And I think that's the most important thing I can say is, before you do start on your journey, do all the research that you need to do, ask all the questions, and do as much as you need to before you start, so that you can be as prepared as possible, because it's a roller coaster and it will really take its toll on you. But hopefully it'll all be worth it in the end. Thank you.
Oh, Francesca, honestly, thank you so much for that. That was a fantastic overview. If you're able to stop sharing your screen, which you've done as I've asked, people, if you would like to ask any questions whatsoever, Francesca, please either pop them in the chat or the Q&A. I've had two in advance, Fran, so if it's okay, I'll ask you the first one. So the first one, how much more expensive is shared motherhood?
It's a good question. Now, it depends really on the clinic, I'll say that, because some clinics are, most of them are private. If you're having shared motherhood treatment, it's quite rare that you'll be able to do that through an NHS clinic unless you pay, and pay as a self-funding patient through the NHS. But it is a lot more expensive. If you're looking at an average IVF cycle of, I'd say it's about £7,000. And that's ballpark figure. It could be a lot more, could be a lot less in other places, but you're probably looking at around about 10,000 if you're having shared motherhood, because what they do is they treat you as two people, a couple, rather than one person going through IVF, which again seems pretty unfair to me. But if you also may need to consider the cost of the donor sperm on top of that, which usually is about 900 quid.
Thank you. The second question sent in advance then, we are a gay male couple hoping to do surrogacy. Will we be entitled to mat leave, or will our surrogate get it?
That's a good question. Now, a little while ago, if you'd asked me that, I'd said I don't entirely know, but I've been doing some work on this recently, and you're entitled to paternity leave. Now, your surrogate can take it still, but you're also entitled to it. So she could take a full 9 months if she wanted, or up to a year. As mat leave, but she'd have to discuss that with her employer. But you are also entitled to parental leave and paternity leave, so you can take as long as you need, because by law you can. I'll just check what your policies say at work, because you're absolutely able to, and that you will be well within your rights to request it and take it.
Thank you. And I should say as well that later on in the course, we're joined by Natalie Gamble, who's a leading legal expert, especially surrounding surrogacy, but also in our final week we're joined by Michael, and him and his husband had their children through surrogacy, but they also run an organisation that supports people with surrogacy. So anyone looking to find out more, there's a further 2 options in this course for you as well. So a couple of questions come through the chat then. So first, are there ways around BMI as a barrier to NHS fertility support?
No, I'm sorry. The NHS are pretty much stuck with that. Because it's in the NICE guidelines on criteria for fertility treatment, they do have to adhere to that, and the NICE guidelines set out the BMI. Private fertility clinics don't have to adhere to NICE guidelines. They should take on the recommendations, but the NHS clinics do have to adhere to the BMI criteria in the NICE guidelines, so they won't take anyone that's over the BMI range, which is part of their criteria for treatment. There isn't any way around it, unfortunately. There can be, there can be support from the NHS, so you can be referred to dietitians or nutritionists in the NHS that can support with the weight loss. And then actually separate to that, if you've been diagnosed with something like polycystic ovaries, PCOS, and you are struggling to lose weight, then there might be ways of working with that, not around it so much, but working with that with your team, because for PCOS you're not likely to lose weight very quickly like other people may do, so that it's seen as a barrier that you can't get over. So the PCOS, absolutely. So you can take that as a case and say, look, I do have polycystic ovaries weight. So we need some intervention here, and take that as a case to the NHS for sure.
Thank you. We are a female same-sex couple and we're considering IVF abroad. My wife and I are married. What, if anything, would we need to do to ensure we're both listed as parents on the birth certificate, or would it default to birth mother plus married partner?
That really does depend where you go. I mean, there are some countries, and depends where you're having your treatment, but there are some countries that don't recognise same-sex female relationships. So I think if you've seen some of the work that Laura Rose has done at the moment with the LGBT Mummies tribe in Italy, they're not recognising same-sex female couples anymore. So it's a bit of a tricky question because it depends on where you go, and I don't know the complete laws in the countries. Natalie Gamble is the perfect person to potentially answer this, but I would say just check, because not every country is supportive of same-sex relationships, even if you're married or civil partnered or not married. That it can be quite tricky, and you don't want to get to a situation where you're not recognised as parent in the country where you've had treatment, but when you come back and then there's an issue with immigration and things like that. So I'd definitely say that one for Natalie.
Thank you. And just to let those know attending, Natalie is joining us on the session on the 7th of September. So we have another question, Francesca, on BMI. Is there any consideration for BMI that are based on Caucasian parameters, and as a person of colour, historically it is inaccurate? And this person also says that they have PCOS.
Yeah, no. So that's another issue in itself with BMI, is that it is calculated on an average. It doesn't take into consideration different structures, different bone densities and things like that. For example, if we look at men and their BMI, they're always categorized in a certain way. Yet, we know that they're very different in frame and things like that sometimes to females. But no, it's pretty much set as the way it's always been done, really old-fashioned, really archaic, and doesn't take into consideration anyone different, or from different communities of different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds. So again, I would say it's grounds that you could challenge on. And you're absolutely right to, if you're being turned away from a clinic or being told go and lose weight without any support, and you say, right, I've got PCOS, I have got a bigger frame, my frame and build is a lot different to my partners, for example. You take these cases forward because you need to be looked at as an individual, and not put into a category. And that's the issue, unfortunately, with the NHS at the moment. And I'm not saying badmouth the NHS, I wouldn't be here today because I did, my training and worked in the NHS for many years. But I'm just saying it's just that, they are quite strict and stuck in ways and things haven't moved on. So the only way you can get through with that is by challenging it. So I would definitely take those cases if you can take them to and ask for it to go above, and take it to the commissioner, for example, about your funding. I think it can work. I've seen it work.
Thank you. Another question come through. What is the maternity leave policy for two women having a baby?
So I believe you can share it. So if you are, if the gestational carrier, so the person carrying it and giving birth can take legally up to whatever she's entitled to, and then the partner, dependent on where they work and dependent on the policies there, can take paternity leave. But again, they can take, I'm not sure how much they can legally take, but it does depend on what the employer, their policies. However, there is a case for which is allowed, and it's a governing thing, that a government decision is that you can share the leave. So if the person who gives birth wants to take 6 months off and then the other partner wants to take 6 months, you can negotiate that but check with your employer, because that is something that's done quite a lot, actually.
Fantastic. Oh, Francesca, thank you. That's actually come to the end of the questions for this evening's session. So thank you once again, everyone, for attending. Oh, hang on, another question's come through. Is there allowance for breastfeeding time? My partner wants to breastfeed too. So I think that's a follow-up question to the mat leave.
So that I don't know. What I will say is all employers have a responsibility to allow for to continue breastfeeding at work and support with breastfeeding at work. So again, I'd check with the employer. I don't know what the timeframes allow, but I do know that all employers have a legal obligation to support with breastfeeding at work and returning to work with breastfeeding.
Thank you.
I need to swat up on my HR stuff, don't I?
I meet all other NHS criteria, BMI, etc., but I've been advised that by my GP that my local Kent and Medway clinical commissioning group only provide funding for female couples after 6 cycles of artificial insemination. Realistically, will the output to challenging this be any different? Keen to start our path to parenthood ASAP.
Okay, so the NICE guidelines recommend that you have 6 cycles of IUI before you move on to IVF. So it's tricky. I mean, there is evidence to say that IUI does work, so donor insemination does work, and it can be successful. But it really means, I mean, I'm not going to lie. So donor insemination is a less invasive treatment, and it's also a less successful treatment. So your chances of success with insemination are a lot less than they would be with IVF. I don't think that what I'm going to say to you, there's always grounds to challenge. There's absolutely always grounds to challenge. I think that if we didn't challenge, like Whitney and Meghan, if they didn't keep challenging, campaigning, they wouldn't have got where they are now. So I think that although I wish we didn't have to challenge because it's wrong and it is discriminatory, I think that we have to. So I think you've got any grounds that we've got to challenge, even if that, it isn't down to BMI or, you'll be offered this, but not this. I think that, we should stand up for ourselves, and this is what we need. And this is what, we want to challenge going forward. Do it. I would say, if you want to be parents, and it is a bit of a fight on the hands, but, keep going. And you are well within your rights to do so, absolutely. You shouldn't be discriminated against because you've got PCOS or because of your gender or because of your sexual orientation. This is not what it's about. It's 2023, for God's sake, let's challenge. We've got to, and you're well within your rights to do so.
Thank you. And I should say as well, in week 4, so the 31st of August, I will be joined by my colleague Claire, and she's going to be talking about just this. So what available funding is there on the NHS across the 4 nations of the UK already, and where people who are in same-sex relationships aren't entitled to NHS funding, will sort of offer advice and templates on how to challenge that. Okie dokie. From experience, showing the higher risks of it being unsuccessful helps your case for IVF funding sooner. So that's someone offering advice. We got it because my partner's sperm is limited as they have now transitioned. So we got IVF straight away. Thank you there for offering that advice. And we've had a lovely message, Fran, that I'm just going to share. Thank you, Francesca and Bethan. We need more people like you in the world.
You're welcome.
So I feel that's a lovely note to end this session on. So to let you know, next week, so same time, same link, and we'll be joined by Dr. Gilling Smith from the Agora Clinic, and she's going to talk through in much more detail the options within fertility clinic settings. So again, thank you, Francesca, and we will see you all next week. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.